A thump against the porch boards jolted Callie upright in bed. Wren curled beside her, raised one ear, still half in sleep. The night outside was still, too still. Frost edged the windows like feathers, and as Callie pulled back the curtain, her breath caught. There she was again, a silhouette in the moonlight, muscled, low to the ground, wild but not alone. Just beyond her shoulder, barely visible, a second shape hovered, smaller, blinking. The bobcat didn't flinch beneath Callie's gaze. She held it, owned it, and in her stillness there was a message. She had brought her world to Callie's door. The town of Maple Hollow didn't ask much of its residents. A snow shovel in winter, a wave at the postman, maybe a pie for the neighbor if their dog passed. That was enough. For Callie Stone, it was everything she needed. Her white farmhouse sat at the edge of town, where the cracked road turned to gravel and the trees thickened into forest. It had been hers and Jonah's, until it wasn't. Now it was hers alone, though she still paused at the second rocking chair on the porch, hand hovering, before setting her coffee down on only one side. She filled her days with quiet things. Carving spoons and little animals from the birch wood Jonah had stacked 3 winters ago. Writing letters to her sister in Vermont she never mailed. Feeding Wren, her calico cat who had gone deaf with age but still followed her from room to room like a slow-moving shadow. Silence had never been so busy. The locals called her Miss Callie, the way small towns often do with women who never remarry but always offer good jam and a knowing smile. She didn't mind. Titles didn't matter in the stillness of her routines. In the smell of cedar. In the click of her knitting needles on snowy afternoons. It was mid-November when the stillness began to shift. She'd taken her usual morning walk just after sunrise. The air carried that copper smell of coming snow, and the frost on the grass cracked like brittle lace beneath her boots. The sugar maples were bare now, their limbs black against the pearl sky. Wren had tried to follow her, meowing indignantly at the back door, before retreating to her fleece-lined basket with a dramatic flop. Callie hummed under her breath as she passed the trailhead. She didn't stray too far into the woods. Jonah always said the trail past Old Rock Bend was for folks younger or braver. But that day, something tugged her steps a little further, just enough to see the birches give way to pine, and there between the trunks she saw it, a shape, low, quiet, watching. At first, she thought it was a trick of shadow, maybe a coyote or a deer crouched in thicket. But then it moved, smooth, deliberate. A bobcat. Her coat was dappled with grey and amber, her legs thick and powerful, paws larger than they should be for her frame. She stood barely 30 feet away. Callie froze. Everything in her body told her to back up, slowly, respect the distance. But her feet didn't move. Her breath didn't either. The cat didn't stalk, didn't snarl. She just stood, eyes locked on Callie like she was trying to place her face from a long-ago dream. And then, something strange. She blinked, slow, cat-like, and turned, not away in panic, just a pivot, a pause, and a look back, as if checking if Callie would follow. She didn't. Not then. But when Callie returned home, her hands couldn't stop trembling. That night, she lit a fire earlier than usual. Wren curled against her leg on the old velvet armchair as flames cracked and shifted behind the grate. The scent of cinnamon hung in the air, Jonah's favourite candle, still half burned on the mantel, though the label had peeled. She stared at the rocking chair across from her, empty, unmoving. Her thoughts kept pulling back to those eyes, not frightened, not wild in the usual way. They had looked through her, not at her. She got up only once that night, when Wren lifted her head suddenly and stared at the door. Callie stepped softly to the porch, wrapped in Jonah's old cardigan. Nothing moved, no sound, but her skin tingled as if something had just passed moments before, like a current left behind by something unseen. She didn't sleep well. The next morning brought wind that snapped through the shutters and scattered leaves across the steps. As Callie opened the back door to toss out coffee grounds, she paused. There, in the frost, prints, round, clean, no claws, deep where the wood dipped under weight, leading up to the porch and back out again. She crouched slowly, joints complaining. Wren sniffed the air behind her. Not raccoon, she murmured, studying the spacing. Not fox. Bobcat. She wasn't dreaming. Something had stood right here, close enough to press breath against the glass, and walked away again. Wren meowed low in her throat, pacing. Her tail flicked, not with alarm, more like uncertainty. I know, girl, Callie whispered, scratching behind her ears. I feel it too. That evening, Callie found herself setting out a shallow dish of water by the edge of the porch. Not food, not bait, just a gesture. It felt foolish, but also like something else, respect. She swept the boards clean, habit from her carpentry days, so she'd know if the prince returned. She left the porch light off, sat by the fire, waited without meaning to. By midnight she stepped out again. The wind had quieted, stars blinked through bare branches like scattered salt. The house behind her gave off the faintest light, enough to see by. She heard nothing, saw nothing, but her breath came a little slower. Her hands didn't tremble this time. Something had shifted. Something was watching, even if unseen. She didn't bring fear. She brought a question. The following morning, the porch told its own story. Callie opened the door with her usual mug in hand, mismatched pottery from a long-closed roadside stand, and nearly spilled the coffee. The frost was fresh, sugar-white, but broken. Tracks. Clearer this time, round, spaced, confident. They led from the yard to the steps, then looped back again, a figure 8 of presence. She stood in the open doorway, the rising light behind her, casting long shadows across the floorboards. Wren rubbed against her ankle, then paused, eyes locked on the same faint markings. Callie set the mug down without sipping, lowered herself to a crouch. The prince circled the wool doormat, skirted the flower pot of dead lavender she refused to throw out, and stopped, right at the chair where Jonah used to sit. The chair no one sat in anymore. And there, just beside one leg of it, a single strand, a whisker. Pale, curved like a fishing hook, barely clinging to the edge of a splintered board. Callie reached out gently, pinched it between her fingers. It bent in the wind but didn't break. She held it for a long time. A gift, a sign she didn't pretend to know. But it didn't feel like an accident. The wind picked up, sharp, playful, and rustled the bare branches overhead. Maple Hollow was full of legends, old trees, deep woods, stories about wolves that didn't howl and deer that moved like ghosts. But this wasn't that. This was real. This was now. That afternoon, Callie went into town. The general store was warm with cinnamon-scented air fresheners and the muffled sound of classic country radio. A teenager was restocking canned peaches in aisle 2. She smiled politely but said nothing. In this town, Callie's presence was expected but not pressed. At checkout, Jim Halpin, who'd run the register since his knees gave out in the 90s, raised a brow as she placed a box of trail mix and a plastic measuring bowl on the counter. Expecting company? He asked with a grin. Callie shrugged. Maybe. You've got that look, he said, tapping his temple. The kind that says something's up, but you're not ready to say it out loud. Then I guess you'll have to wait, Jim. He chuckled and handed her the receipt. Fair enough. Say hi to Wren for me. Callie drove home with the heat just high enough to keep the windshield from fogging. The sun hung low, yellow and cold. Shadows reached long across the pasture as she pulled into the gravel driveway. Back at the house, she filled the bowl with water, fresh this time, and placed it just off the porch, near the broken step she kept forgetting to fix. Close, but not too close, a neutral zone. Then she sat. The sun was dropping fast, setting the tops of the trees ablaze in rust-colored light. Wren padded out quietly and curled at her feet. Time slowed, and then sound. Not footsteps, not breath, just the subtle tension that falls when you're no longer alone. A shadow moved just beyond the fence line. Callie didn't turn her head, didn't dare. The bobcat stepped into view. Her gait was quiet, purposeful. She was smaller than Callie remembered, maybe because memory stretches things when it tries to make them stay. But she was no less certain. Her shoulders rolled beneath her coat like waves beneath snow. She paused at the edge of the yard. Callie didn't move. She could feel her heartbeat everywhere, her throat, her wrists, her ribs. The bobcat's eyes glinted. Then, with unhurried grace, she walked toward the porch, not to the bowl of water, but beside it, past it, to the base of the steps, and then she did something unexpected. She looked up, directly at Callie. There was no fear in it, no threat either, just recognition, as if to say, I know you were waiting. Wren, eyes wide, made a low humming sound in her throat, but didn't hiss. Callie swallowed. The bobcat blinked slowly, then turned, without rushing, and walked the length of the porch from below, brushing lightly against the corner post. She stopped near the chair again, sniffed the base. And then, only then, she stepped to the bowl, touched it once with her paw, didn't drink, and vanished back into the trees. Callie sat motionless long after the frost began to gather again on the railing. Not a dream, not a story, an agreement, unspoken, unearned, but real. She wasn't hunting, she was remembering. The wind had gone still, not calm, still, as if even the trees were holding their breath. Callie cracked the window just enough to let the air touch her face. It was brittle with cold, but alive with something else. The kind of night you feel before you hear. One that speaks in tones lower than sound. She didn't bother with the porch light. She hadn't turned it on in days. The bowl was still out there, the chair still empty, and something told her tonight would be different. Wren stirred from the hearth rug but didn't follow. She just watched, tail flicking in half circles, slow and thoughtful. Callie stepped outside in her housecoat and boots, Jonah's cardigan pulled tight around her. The deck boards creaked, softer now, as if learning the rhythm of her silence. Moonlight laced the yard like pale ribbon, and there, at the edge of the clearing, she waited. The bobcat. Not pacing this time, not watching from afar, waiting. Callie didn't move from the top step, just breathed, felt the weight of the air settle into her chest. The bobcat stepped forward. One paw, then another. Her body flowed in low arcs, muscles coiled and quiet. She moved like a question without punctuation. She climbed the first step. Callie's breath caught. Another. Then stopped, mid-porch, less than 5 feet away. They were eye level now. The bobcat didn't flinch. She sniffed the cold air, ears twitching toward the soft rustle of pine needles. Then her eyes came back to Callie's. Still, wide, unblinking, the porch between them held years, losses, longings, things unsaid and too long delayed. The bobcat sat, not in crouch, not in warning, in presence. Callie lowered herself slowly into the rocking chair across from Jonah's. The wood sighed beneath her, but she didn't break her gaze. The cardigan hung loose now, open at the chest. Her fingers trembled against the armrest, and then the bobcat did something neither feral nor trained. She turned, faced the house, looked inside, through the sliver of curtain left open, past the firelight flickering on the far wall, past Wren's still silhouette in the window, as if measuring it all, not with hunger, with memory, or something older. Callie followed her gaze. The house was quiet, warm, lived in, imperfect. The scent of applewood, the slow pop of ash falling in the grate, Wren blinking once, then again, and not looking away. The bobcat exhaled through her nose, soft, steady, and rose. She paced to the edge of the porch, paused by the bowl, lowered her head but didn't drink. Her tail flicked once, and then, like smoke drawn back into shadow, she stepped down the far end and disappeared into the tree line. Callie stayed seated. She wasn't cold, not in the usual way. The kind of warmth that filled her chest had nothing to do with fire. It had to do with knowing she had been chosen, not owned, not invaded, chosen. The forest behind the fence grew thick again with darkness, but it didn't feel threatening. It felt full, expectant, the kind of silence that comes just before a door opens. She was deciding if this was a place she could leave something behind. The air smelled like snow that hadn't yet fallen. Callie woke before sunrise, not from any sound, but from a pull in her chest, like memory had reached out in her sleep and tapped gently at her shoulder. Wren was still curled in her basket, one paw over her eyes, purring softly in her dreams. Callie pulled on her boots with fingers that remembered her youth, even if her knees didn't. The cardigan hung loose on her shoulders as she stepped onto the porch, breath puffing clouds into the dim morning. And then she saw it. At first, she thought it was the curled shadow of a leaf. But then it moved, tiny, tucked, right beside the boot scraper. A kitten. Small, barely larger than her palm, crouched low, tail wrapped tight around its belly. Its ears were stubby and tufted, its fur soft and mottled, like the leaf scatter at the edge of the yard. A bobcat kitten. Her heart stumbled. It didn't run. It didn't even flinch. It just blinked up at her, eyes wide and dark as river stones. Callie stood frozen at the top of the steps. A rustle came from the woods. Her eyes shifted, and there, just beyond the brush, the mother waited, half shrouded in pine shadow. Still as bark, watching, not hidden, not bold, present, a second offering of trust, a choice. The kitten wobbled forward a step, front legs uncertain on the frost-covered plank. It made a small chirp, high and broken, like a wind-up toy half out of tune. Then it sat again, still. Callie lowered herself slowly to the top step, bones creaking like old hinges. The distance between them was only 3 feet, but it may as well have been a lifetime. She didn't speak. Words would only cloud what was already being said. The bobcat in the woods blinked once, then turned, without sound, and melted back into shadow. Callie exhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. The kitten didn't cry out. It simply stayed, like it had been placed, not abandoned, delivered, not lost. Wren appeared beside her, stretching with the practiced elegance of a cat who chose her entrances. She sniffed the air. Her ears twitched. Then, without drama, she stepped down, padded to the edge of the steps, and sat beside the kitten. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then Wren lay down, nose to nose with the little one, and began grooming its ear. Callie pressed her hand to her mouth. Her throat burned, but not from cold, not since Jonah, not since the silence swallowed the house, not since she stopped expecting anyone to come back. And yet here it was, this tiny, trembling life, left in her care. No instructions, no warnings, just eyes that said, "Can this be home?" She didn't reach out, not yet. Instead, she let the moment settle, let the porch remember what it was like to hold something sacred again. The kitten, comforted by Wren's quiet acceptance, curled in tighter against her, a small, trusting ball of warmth. Callie stayed with them, wrapped in her cardigan, until the sun lifted above the trees and painted the frost into silver threads. Her coffee went cold on the windowsill. The mail remained unchecked. Time loosened its grip, as it always did when something important was happening. Later, she set out an old wool scarf beside the step, folded gently, worn soft from years of use. The kitten sniffed it, circled twice, and sank in with a sigh, too small to hear. And in that silence, Callie understood what had happened. This wasn't a mistake. This was an answer to a question she hadn't known she was still asking. She didn't leave her behind. She left her forward. By the second morning, the wind had shifted. You could feel it in the trees. Their branches no longer creaked, but whispered, like they were passing a secret down the line. The forest had changed, not loud, not visible, just quieter, in a way that suggested something new had been accepted. Callie rose with the same early rhythm, though sleep had not come easily. The kitten, still unnamed, had spent the night curled against the wool scarf beside the stove, warm and unafraid. Wren slept near, never touching, always watching. Outside, frost dusted the porch steps again, though lighter this time, delicate as breath on glass. Callie stepped onto the porch with her coat draped over her shoulders, eyes adjusting to the early light, and froze. A second kitten, sitting at the bottom of the steps, smaller than the first, darker fur with faint spots across its belly and a kink in the tail that gave it a crooked, curious shape. Its ears twitched, and it let out a sharp, unsure mew that cracked the morning in two. Callie's breath caught in her throat. She scanned the edge of the trees, and there she was, the mother, standing at the clearing, body rigid, eyes burning with something unreadable, not fear, not threat, something deeper, calculation, or perhaps trust being tested again. The new kitten gave a little stumble forward, its legs shaky and uneven. It cried out again, and Wren appeared at Callie's heels like a whisper. She peered down at the small creature, tail low but not stiff. Callie crouched slowly, hands on her knees, the cold seeping through her bones. The bobcat didn't move. She watched. The kitten tried to climb the first step and failed, tumbling backward into the frost. It shook itself off and tried again. This time, Callie reached out, not fast, not touching, just steady, palm open invitation. The kitten hesitated, sniffed the air, and then, step by uncertain step, climbed onto the first board, then the second, then onto the porch itself. Callie didn't move. She felt Wren press against her leg, purring low. A quiet rumble of reassurance. The kitten pressed its nose to Callie's hand, tentative, trembling, and then sneezed in surprise, the sound so small and startled that Callie laughed aloud before she could stop herself. It was the first real laugh she'd heard in the house since Jonah passed. The bobcat blinked slowly from the trees and turned. Without a sound, she vanished back into the woods. She had delivered her second child and left. No goodbyes, no final glances, just a mother who knew what needed to be done. Callie lifted the new kitten gently, careful to support its tiny body, its heart fluttering against her fingers like a trapped leaf. It didn't resist. She brought it inside where the fire was still smouldering, and the wool blanket was still warm. The first kitten chirped at the sight of its sibling, then approached, sniffed, and gave one soft, contented nudge. They curled into each other without hesitation. Callie knelt beside them, her knees aching, her eyes burning, with the kind of heat that only comes from memory being rewritten in real time. Wren sat nearby, tail curled around her side like a comma waiting to be finished. Callie whispered, "Well, this is something, isn't it?" The room didn't answer. It didn't have to. Outside, the sky began to brighten, and the wind stirred through the birches. It carried with it the scent of cedar and the soft rustle of life rearranging itself. Later, when she drove into town for supplies, she passed Jim Halpern again at the store. He waved from behind the counter. "Still quiet up at your place?" Callie smiled. She thought of the tiny bodies sleeping beside her stove, of the eyes watching from the trees, of the silence that now felt full instead of empty. "Not quite as quiet as it used to be," she said. He laughed. "Well, that's good, Miss Callie. Silence is fine, long as it doesn't overstay its welcome." She nodded, choosing not to explain. Some stories can't be told until they're ready. Some aren't meant to be told at all. Love didn't need to be tamed. It just needed shelter. It happened on the coldest night of December. The kind of night when even the stars seemed to shiver, their light crisp and unmoving, caught in a sky too clear to hide anything. Callie had been sitting by the fire, her carving knife resting on the side table, a half-finished figurine in her lap, a small bobcat, delicate paws curled under, ears sharp. She hadn't meant for it to look like the mother, but somehow it had shaped itself that way. The kittens, both now almost double their original size, lay sprawled near the hearth, one on its back, legs twitching in dream. The other tucked into Wren's side, the old cat now acting less like a guardian and more like a worn-down aunt who had begrudgingly accepted her fate. The night was quiet, too quiet. Callie felt it before she heard it. She rose and stepped to the door, opened it slowly. The cold met her like a breath held too long, and there, once more, stood the bobcat. She was thinner now, her fur duller. The forest had asked much of her these past weeks. But her eyes were the same. She didn't look at the house, not at first. She stepped onto the porch, her paws making no sound against the wood. Callie didn't move. The bobcat walked to the empty rocking chair, Jonah's chair, and brushed against it with her flank, slow and deliberate, like memory slipping past skin. Then she turned to face the door. Callie met her gaze through the screen. They stood like that for a long moment. No barrier between them except silence. And even that seemed thinner tonight. The bobcat blinked, once, slow. And in that blink, something passed. A knowing, a farewell. Callie opened the screen gently and stepped outside. Her boots creaked against the boards. The wind lifted her hair, now all silver and soft. She didn't reach out. She just stood beside the rocking chair. The bobcat looked up at her, not pleading, not questioning, just present. Then she lowered her head and lapped once from the now frozen bowl of water. Her tongue barely touched the ice before she paused. She turned and walked. Not quickly, not hidden, but with the certainty of someone who had done what she came to do. At the edge of the woods, she stopped. She looked back. Not at the house, at the porch, at the place. And then she was gone, swallowed by the trees, by the silence she'd once pierced. Callie stood on the porch for a long time after. The wind moved past her like a sigh. Inside, the kittens chirped in their sleep. Wren shifted and stretched. The fire popped, but the porch remained still. Something sacred had ended, and something enduring had begun. She came to make sure they had a home before the snow. By March, the snow began to loosen its grip. Drips from the eaves played rhythms on the porch roof, and the wind smelled less like ice and more like soil waking up. The sugar maples stood tall and wet, their trunks dark with sap rising again. A season had turned without announcement, just the steady melting of what once seemed unmovable. Callie stood at the window, her palm flat to the glass, watching the last mounds of snow sag into puddles along the garden path. A blue jay darted past, bold and loud, and she smiled. Inside, the kittens, though she still struggled to call them that, bounded through the kitchen like furry comets. They had grown leaner, stronger. Their coats had thickened, spotted with colour now, bold and rich. They no longer fit in the wool scarf they used to curl into. She'd stopped trying to name them. They were not pets, not really. But they were hers, or maybe she was theirs. They knew the boundaries now, the way the old porch step groaned before sunrise, the exact spot near the stove where warmth pooled best, the rhythm of her voice as she read aloud in the evenings, not for them, but not for them either. Wren had taken on the role of reluctant matriarch. She no longer followed them from room to room, but instead monitored their chaos from her perch on the windowsill, eyes half-lidded, tail wrapped around her paws like punctuation. Outside, birdsong returned in flickers. Life was happening again. And still, some part of Callie waited. For what? She couldn't say. Perhaps for the rustle in the underbrush. The sudden catch of gold eyes beneath the pine, a final blink from the shadows. But the bobcat never returned. Not once, not in snow or wind or thaw. Her absence was not a wound, it was a presence all its own. Callie honoured it the only way she knew how. She carved. On a late April morning, she carried 2 small wooden figures out to the porch. One, a mother bobcat, poised, strong, tail curved with quiet command. The other, a single kitten, curled as it had been that first night beside the boot scraper, ears tilted in sleep. She set them side by side on the windowsill outside Jonah's chair. They faced the woods, always the woods. Then she did something she hadn't done in nearly 2 years. She pulled Jonah's chair forward, dusted it off, sat. The wood creaked as if remembering her weight. She rested her hands on her knees, felt the sun through her sleeves. The air was soft, full of mud, and green things still curled beneath the surface. The 2 kittens were napping inside, their legs tangled together in a way that suggested peace, not dependency. She let her eyes drift closed, and that's when she heard it. Not a footfall, not a breath. Just the faintest sound, a feather brushing wood. She opened her eyes slowly. On the porch rail, directly in front of her, lay a single whisker. Long, pale, curved like a signature. She didn't cry, she just picked it up, rolled it between her fingers like a thread from a long finished seam, and placed it beside the carvings. Not a goodbye, a bookmark. That afternoon, she wrote a letter. No address, just a note. Folded and tucked into the drawer by her bed. Some bonds aren't built to last, but some aren't built to end either. They change, they return in different forms, in paw prints, in laughter, in the warmth of something sleeping nearby. If you ever find yourself in a quiet place, listen, the wild leaves echoes behind. and sometimes it leaves family too. She signed it with her initials. Then she closed the drawer, stepped outside, and let spring wrap around her like something earned.